The valley floor lay quiet beneath the rising sun. Mist clung to ferns and tall cycads, while the distant call of insects filled the still air. A small herd of Camptosaurus moved between streams, their heads low as they grazed on tender shoots. Muscles shifted under rough hides built for both speed and endurance. Every ear twitched at the faintest crack in the brush. The piece felt fragile like glass about to break. Shadows stretched along the ridge above, and danger was close though unseen. The herd pressed together, knowing that survival depended on vigilance and swift feet. The valley of the late Jurassic spread wide, under a pale sky painted by the glow of early light. Red cliffs framed the horizon, and narrow streams wound through low ground where ferns grew thick. Tall cycads rose like watchtowers, while clusters of conifers shaded pools that reflected the still dawn. The air carried the cool breath of night, yet held the weight of heat waiting to rise. From the cover of mist came the gentle sounds of feeding a steady rhythm of jaws cropping plants, and the rustle of bodies shifting through dew-soaked undergrowth. A herd of Camptosaurus moved as one. Their shapes were sturdy, with hind limbs strong, and tails stretched like balancing poles. Each step was careful, yet steady, for the ground had stones and roots that could twist an ankle and leave a creature vulnerable. They were plant eaters, yet never careless. Their large eyes swept across shadow and light, catching every hint of movement in the brush. The valley was rich with food, but it was also filled with danger. At the center of the herd walked the older female, who carried the weight of leadership. Scars lined her flanks, reminders of seasons past when predators had struck and been met with a storm of hooves and tails. She guided the group with short grunts and low calls that carried across the ferns. The young followed close, weaving between larger bodies, their small frames quick and nervous. At the rear moved a strong male watch of the trail behind them, his head raised often to test the wind. The life of a Camptosaurus was a balance between hunger and caution. Dawn brought the safest hours when predators lingered in dens or rested after night hunts. Yet even at this time, peace never lasted. The herd fed in short bursts, lifting heads, often ears twitching, eyes wide. Every snapped twig in the distance sent ripples of unease through the group. They had learned through endless seasons that silence was never to be trusted. The valley was home to more than gentle grazers. Tracks in the mud near the stream spoke of larger shapes with claws that tore the ground deep. There were predators that stalked the herds with patience and strength. The scent of danger often drifted on the wind, carried by nothing more than a faint musk of reptilian skin warmed by the sun. Every Camptosaurus knew the meaning of such scents, though they never saw the hunter itself. Instinct told them that danger always walked close. The morning passed with the herd grazing along a shallow stream. Water glimmered as sunlight struck its ripples, and dragonflies skimmed across the surface. Young Camptosaurus splashed briefly before being called back by the sharp warning sound of their elders. Open water offered no protection, and predators often watched such places, knowing herds needed to drink. The group moved again, shifting steadily between clumps of cycads, keeping to cover where possible. The land itself shaped their movements. Cliffs forced narrow paths, and boulders split the ground into channels, where only one or two animals could pass at a time. These choke points made the herd uneasy, for they limited escape. At such places the leader paused and raised her head high, listening for the faintest sign of approach. Only when the way ahead was clear did she signal the herd forward with a low grunt. Survival was never chance. It was earned by constant vigilance. The older female carried memories in her scars, but also in her knowledge of routes and seasons. She knew where the ferns grew thickest after rain, where streams lingered when the dry season burned the land, and where the cliffs held caves safe for resting. Her memory was a thread that bound the herd to safety. Without her, the young would not know the paths, and the herd would scatter into danger. The day grew warmer, and shadows shrank on the blaze of the sun. Heat shimmered above the stones, and insects whined in the air. The herd slowed, seeking shade under the conifers. They fed in silence, their tails swaying gently to drive off biting flies. Rest was brief, for the heat carried new risks. It dulled the senses and left bodies weary. Predators often use the haze of midday to approach unseen. The leader remained alert, never resting fully, her eyes locked often on the ridges above. By late afternoon, the herd shifted again, moving toward a wide plain where ferns stretched like a green sea. Here food was plentiful, yet the openness left them exposed. They entered slowly, spreading in a loose line, so that no animal stood alone. Heads lifted often as they grazed, each one turning to match the gaze of another. This weaving network of attention formed their defense. No predator could easily strike without being seen by at least one pair of watchful eyes. The valley carried stories beyond those of this single herd. Bones lay half buried in the soil, telling of hunts won and lost. Skulls cracked open by teeth spoke of battles with predators whose strength outweighed speed. Every Camptosaurus that grazed among the ferns stepped over the remains of those who had come before. The land was both cradle and grave, and they knew its lessons in their bones. As evening neared, the herd sought water once more. The stream at the far edge of the valley was narrow and lined with reeds. Birds scattered as the herd approached, and the air filled with the hum of insects. The leader lowered her head to drink, but her eyes never left the reeds. Ripples on the water stirred unease, though no shape broke the surface. She grunted sharply, and the herd shifted back from the edge. Water meant life, but it also meant risk. On a ridge above the plain, a shadow moved. It was silent and quick, withdrawing before the herd could fully notice. Yet the sharp eyes of the rear male caught the flicker. He raised his head high and released a deep call that rolled across the herd. The animals froze their bodies, tense tails stiff. The shadow did not return, but the message was clear. They were not alone in this valley. Something watched them from above. Nightfall approached with a slow sweep of shadow across stone and fern. The herd gathered close on a patch of high ground where the wind carried scents clearly and the view stretched wide. They huddled in a circle, young in the center, adults forming a barrier of bodies. The leader remained at the edge, head lifted against the darkening sky. Her gaze lingered on the ridges where the shadow had passed. Silence settled heavy, yet her stance showed no ease. The valley was never still. It was a stage where survival played out endlessly. Each day offered food, and each night offered fear. The herd of Camptosaurus lived within this rhythm, shaped by instinct, memory, and the leadership of one scarred female. They would graze, they would move, they would drink, and they would always remain alert. For beyond the ferns and beyond the streams lay threats waiting for the moment when vigilance failed. And though the herd did not yet know it, a new season of trials had begun. The shadow on the ridge was not chance, but the first sign of a challenge that would test the strength and unity of every Camptosaurus in the valley. The first full night after the shadow's sighting passed heavy with unease. The herd slept little. The adults shifted often their tails, scraping the soil, their heads snapping up at every sound. Insects hummed through the darkness and frogs croaked near the stream, yet the tension never eased. When the sun finally returned spilling gold across the cliffs, the herd stirred with tired eyes. The older female led them down toward fresh ferns over steps, carried caution sharper than before. By mid-morning, the valley shimmered under the climb of heat. Camptosaurus were not hunters, yet they understood pursuit well. They knew the rhythm of stalk and strike from memory of narrow escapes. That morning, the rear male lifted his head often. He tested the air, then moved faster, forcing the herd to quicken their pace. The leader matched him with low calls, pressing the herd through the fern field with urgency. Something unseen followed. The first test came at the river. The herd had crossed the stretch many times, yet that day the water seemed restless. Ripples stirred across its surface, though no breeze blew. The young moved close to their mothers, their high-pitched cries mixing with the low calls of the adults. As the first animal stepped into the shallows, a crash tore through the reeds. The water erupted with the form of a predator not larger than the adults, but fierce with jaws snapping. The herd broke into chaos. Water churned with bodies leaping for shore. The leader slammed her tail against the river to drive spray into the face of the attacker. It snapped again, missing by a breath, as the herd surged to safety. The predator lunged once more, but the sheer mass of fleeing Camptosaurus forced it back into the reeds. In moments, the river was empty except for scattered ripples and drifting ferns torn by hooves. The herd gathered on dry ground, shaking with fear, yet alive. The young pressed against their mothers, trembling. The leader released a deep call, one that carried both command and comfort. Slowly, order returned. The herd moved again, choosing a longer route that wound through stony ridges away from the river. They would drink later at a safer pool, though thirst would gnaw at them through the day. That night hunger pressed hard against the herd. The valley's plants were thick, but moving in constant fear burned strength quickly. The young cried, often their small bellies empty. The adults bent to feed, yet lifted heads after each bite. The shadow was never far. At times stones rattled on high ledges, though no form revealed itself. At other times the air carried faint musk of reptile skin sharp enough to sting the nose. 3 days passed in this rhythm of tension. On the fourth, the herd faced a greater test. Storm clouds gathered from the west, rolling dark across the horizon. The wind shifted cold and dry at first, then thick with dust. By late afternoon, sand lifted in sheets that stung eyes and hid the ground. The leader pushed the herd into a narrow canyon, where stone walls gave some shelter. The storm roared for hours, filling the air with dust so thick even the nearest forms blurred. The Camptosaurus huddled close each animal, leaning into another for strength. The young were hidden beneath adult bodies, shielded from flying grit. The storm carried the cries of unseen creatures scattered across the valley. When the dust at last thinned, the herd emerged with eyes red and throats dry. The landscape had changed. Paths were buried. Pools were filled with sand. New gullies cut the ground where flash floods had torn through. This change forced the herd onto unfamiliar routes. The leader stepped carefully over shifting soil, her senses stretched to breaking. The rear male limped slightly, his leg cut by stone during the storm. Yet he pressed on, refusing to fall behind. The herd followed with blind trust, knowing only that their survival depended on the scarred female, who carried memory older than any of them. Food grew scarce along these new paths. The ferns were scattered thin, and many had been stripped by other herds driven here by the same storm. Camptosaurus were built for endurance, yet hunger bit deep when days passed without full feeding. The adults ate little, saving what they could for the young. Each step grew heavier, tails dragging faint furrows in the dust. Still they moved, for stopping meant death. Predators sensed weakness. Tracks fresh and deep appeared often in the sand. A roar echoed across the cliffs, one dawn shaking birds from the trees. The herd froze, their hearts racing. The sound was deeper than before, a rival stronger than the river hunter. The older female raised her head, eyes narrow. She had known this challenge would come. Every scar on her body spoke of such trials. The test arrived at dusk 2 nights later. The herd grazed cautiously in a shallow basin ringed by boulders. Shadows lengthened across the ground. The air grew still heavy with the promise of attack. From the stones above came the scrape of claws, then silence. The rear male called sharp, and the herd bolted toward the open side of the basin. Rocks clattered down as the rival revealed itself. It was larger than the river predator, its hide darker, its body built for strength, its jaws open wide, flashing teeth that glistened red in fading light. It lunged yet struck only dust as the herd burst free. Hooves pounded the ground in a storm of sound, tails swayed to keep balance. The predator gave chase, snapping at the last animals, yet finding only empty air. The herd ran until stars lit the sky, their bodies shaking with exhaustion. At last they slowed near a grove of cycads. There the leader called them close, forcing a circle for rest. She bore a fresh scrape across her flank, where stone had cut during the flight. The rear male's limp had worsened, yet he stood guard without falter. The herd slept in broken moments, always with ears pricked for sound. Days stretched into weeks of hardship. Water holes dried. Fern fields thinned. Predators pressed harder, sensing weakness. The herd lost 2 young to hunger and exhaustion, their cries fading into silence beneath the weight of the dry season. The older female grieved, yet did not falter. She pushed the herd onward, always onward toward places she remembered from seasons past where streams never failed. The journey carried them across broken ridges and wide plains of dust. Storms came again in brief bursts of rain that turned the ground to mud, then dried to cracked earth. Each challenge hardened the herd. Their bodies grew leaner, their steps sharper. The young who survived grew stronger from struggle, their legs quick, their eyes always searching. Yet the rival predator grew bolder. Each night, its roars drew closer. Each day, new tracks scarred the ground near their path. It had chosen them as its prey not for a single strike, but for a campaign of fear and attrition. It knew the herd would weaken with every mile. The leader understood this as well. She knew a final confrontation would come one day when neither herd nor predator could turn aside. The plain of gullies stretched silent under the pale light of dawn. The herd stood gathered, close tails, stiff ears twitching with unease. Mist clung low across the ground, yet the air smelled heavy with danger. The scarred female leader raised her head high, her eyes sweeping the ridges. She knew the rival was near. Weeks of pursuit had led to this place. There would be no escape without battle. The rival appeared from the mist like a shadow given form. Its body was broad and powerful, its hide dark with scars of past fights. Its jaws parted in a low growl that rolled across the ground like thunder. The herd pressed tighter, the young hidden in the center, the adults forming a living wall around them. The rear male limped forward, placing himself near the leader, his breath harsh but steady. For a long moment silence held the plain. The predator circled slow, testing the herd's resolve. The leader stamped her foot against the earth, a heavy thud that carried defiance. The herd responded with a chorus of grunts and tail lashes. The predator lowered its head and lunged. The first strike came swift. It rushed the flank, aiming to scatter the group. The leader met it with a whip of her tail that cracked against its snout. Bone struck hide with a sound that echoed like a branch breaking. The predator reeled, yet snapped back, sinking teeth into empty air. The herd surged in unison, moving as a mass to keep the young shielded. Dust rose beneath their pounding feet, turning the plain into a storm of grit. The rival struck again, cutting across the opposite flank. This time the rear male met it with a heavy shoulder slam. His limp slowed him, yet his weight carried force. The predator snarled jaws, snapping close to his neck. He twisted away, leaving a fresh gash across his side. Blood streaked his hide, but he stood firm. His eyes never left the predator, even as pain tore through him. The herd pressed into a tight circle, tails outward like spears. Each adult lashed at the predator when it drew near. The air filled with the sound of tails striking, hide the cries of the young hen within and the deep growls of the attacker. It circled them again and again, searching for weakness. The scarred female moved with precision, guiding the defense with calls sharp and sure. Then the predator feigned retreat. It backed away into the mist, its dark shape fading. The herd shifted uneasily, hooves stamping, tail swaying. The leader knew better. Her body remained tense, her gaze locked on the mist. She had fought too many battles to be fooled. The rival returned in a rush, bursting from the side with jaws wide. Chaos erupted. The predator slammed into the circle, breaking a gap between two adults. Dust exploded as bodies collided. The young cried in terror as the enemy pushed through. The leader charged headlong, slamming her weight into its shoulder. The impact shook the ground and forced the predator sideways. Teeth snapped inches from a trembling juvenile before the leader shoved the beast clear. The rival roared, shaking its head with rage. Blood dripped from wounds along its snout and shoulder where tails had struck again and again. Yet its hunger burned hotter than pain. It lunged, once more targeting the limping rear male. The male braced his legs and swung his tail with desperate strength. The strike landed square on the predator's jaw, forcing its head aside. But in the motion, the predator caught his flank with its teeth. Flesh tore and blood sprayed across the dust. The herd cried out in alarm. The rear male staggered, yet did not fall. He dragged himself back into the circle, his eyes blazing with defiance. The leader placed herself before him, standing tall. Her scars glistened in the rising light, each one a mark of battle survived. She would not yield now. The final clash came as the predator threw itself at her with all its strength. The two bodies collided with force that sent echoes rolling through the gullies. The leader's tail lashed again and again, striking ribs and throat. The predator bit deep into her shoulder, tearing flesh, yet she drove forward, pressing her bulk against it. Hooves dug into soil, pushing with raw power. For a moment, predator and prey locked in a deadly embrace, each straining for dominance. Dust swirled around them, hiding the world beyond. The herd pressed tighter, calling with frantic cries. The young cowered low, their eyes wide with fear. The leader shifted her weight, driving the predator into a shallow gully. Its footing slipped on loose stone. She struck with her tail one final time, smashing against its neck with all her strength. The crack of impact rang loud. The predator faltered, its body twisting awkwardly. It tried to rise, but its limbs failed. With a last guttural roar, the leader stomped her foot hard against the ground beside its head. The predator's growl faded into silence. Its body shuddered once and stilled. Dust drifted slowly back to Earth, settling over both victor and fallen foe. The herd stood frozen in the aftermath. The rear male bled heavily, yet still stood his breath ragged. The young peeked from between the bodies of their mothers, eyes filled with awe and fear. The leader swayed with exhaustion, blood streaming from her shoulder, yet her stance remained proud. She lifted her head high and released a call that echoed across the plain. It was not a call of triumph, but of survival. The sound rolled through the gullies and faded into the rising sun. The predator lay still, its shadow no longer stalking the herd. The battle had ended, yet the cost was heavy. Scars new and old marked their bodies. Their strength was tested beyond measure. The herd pressed close around their leader, touching her flanks, with muzzles grunting soft in unity. They had survived because they had stood together. The plain that had threatened to be their grave became the ground of their defiance. The herd moved slowly from the site, leaving the fallen predator to the scavengers that would soon gather. The leader limped yet kept her head high, guiding them once more toward the promise of water and shade. The rival was gone. The valley would hold peace for a time, though every Camptosaurus knew peace never lasted long. The battle was over, yet its echoes lingered across the plain. Dust still hung in the air, drifting like smoke after a wildfire. The body of the fallen predator lay twisted in the shallow gully, its once fearsome shape, now nothing more than still flesh. Flies already gathered, drawn by the sharp scent of blood. The herd of Camptosaurus did not look back as they began to move away. For them to linger was to invite scavengers, or even worse, another rival drawn by the smell of death. The leader's steps were heavy but steady. Her shoulder throbbed with pain where the predator's teeth had torn deep, yet she carried herself with unbroken pride. The herd followed, close pressing around her in silent reverence. Each one bore wounds from the fight, whether cuts across their hides or bruises from blows, yet all were alive. That fact alone was their triumph. The rear male limped more heavily than before, his side torn where teeth had raked. Blood had slowed to a trickle, but the wound was raw and deep. Still he walked, refusing to let weakness break his stride. Now and then another adult brushed against him, lending support when his steps faltered. The young huddled near the center, still shaken by the terror of the attack, yet their eyes followed their elders with growing admiration. They had seen strength and unity, and it had burned the memory of fear into a lesson of survival. By midday the herd reached a shallow stream that wound between stones at the edge of a wooded rise. The water glistened under sunlight, cool and clear. The leader lowered her muzzle to drink, and the others followed. The cold water washed the taste of dust from their mouths. The herd lingered here, letting their bodies rest while their senses remained alert. Though the predator was gone, the world of the Jurassic never allowed comfort for long. Bird-like cries echoed from the trees above, where smaller creatures flitted in the branches. Insects hummed around the stream, and the sound of water over stones soothed weary nerves. The young splashed clumsily in the shallows, shaking free from the fear that clung to them. The adults stood in a circle, even now their bodies forming a barrier against unseen danger. Old habits and instinct guided every movement. The leader rested near the bank, her head lowered, eyes half closed. Pain pulsed with each breath, yet her mind remained sharp. She remembered the weight of the predator against her body, the flash of its teeth, the crack of her tail striking bone. Each moment would remain etched in her memory as another scar carved not on flesh but on spirit. She knew predators would return again and again, for that was the way of life. Yet she also knew her herd was strong enough to endure. The rear male drank deeply before sinking onto his belly in the shade. His sides heaved with the effort of standing so long, yet relief softened his gaze. The leader moved near him, brushing her muzzle against his flank. It was not affection in the human sense, but a gesture of acknowledgement and respect. He had stood against death and bought precious moments for the herd. Without him, the young might not have lived. His wounds would heal slowly, if at all, but his place among them was secured by his courage. Hours passed. The herd fed on ferns and low shrubs near the water, their strength slowly returning. The land around them carried the smells of life, both calm and dangerous. Far in the distance the call of another predator drifted faint, but not near enough to threaten. The herd kept together, wary but confident. Every scar on their bodies told a story of survival, and every step forward reminded them of what unity could accomplish. As the sun lowered, shadows stretched long across the ground. The leader guided them away from the stream toward the shelter of a grove where tall trees rose thick and steady. Here the air was cooler, the ground soft with fallen leaves. The herd settled in a loose circle, young nestled in the center, adults forming the edges. Night would soon fall, and with it new dangers. Yet for this moment they had safety. The leader lifted her head to the fading sky. Stars began to pierce the growing darkness, while the air cooled. She listened to the sounds of the forest, the chirping of insects, the rustle of small creatures, in the underbrush the distant splash of water where fish leapt. These were the sounds of life, continuing as it always had. Her eyes closed, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to rest. The rear male lay nearby, is breathing slower now, though pain still marked his movements. The herd pressed close around him, sharing warmth and protection. Even the youngest seemed to sense his importance. They watched him with wide eyes, learning from his endurance. His body was weakened, but his spirit remained unbroken. He had become a symbol of what it meant to fight, not just for oneself, but for all. Through the night, the herd dozed in shifts, some standing watch, while others rested. When a distant howl rose on the wind, they tensed, but no danger approached. Dawn eventually crept over the horizon, spilling gold across the grove. With the light came renewed determination. The herd rose, shaking off sleep, and began once more to move. The leader walked at the front, her steps steady, though pain burned in her shoulder. Behind her, the rear male followed, supported by the presence of his kin. The young bounded between them, chasing insects and nipping at leaves, their fear eased by the comfort of routine. Life had returned to its rhythm, though the memory of the battle lingered as a shadow just behind them. They moved on not as prey fleeing from death, but as survivors who had faced it and endured. The land ahead stretched wide and filled with challenges, yet also with the promise of new feeding grounds and safe valleys. Together they would continue, for that was their way. In the heart of the herd's strength was not just in muscle or speed, but in unity. Each scar was a reminder not of weakness, but of resilience. The predator that had fallen would not be the last, but it had proven that no rival could break them so long as they stood side by side. The forest opened into rolling plains bathed in morning light. The herd advanced as one, a living tide of strength and endurance. At their head, the scarred leader raised her head high and called to the horizon. Her cry carried across the land a sound of defiance and survival. The world answered only with wind in the grass and the steady rhythm of life continuing. The plains stretched endless beneath the rising sun, and the herd of Camptosaurus pressed forward in silence. Each step carried the memory of the battle left behind, yet also the strength gained from survival. Their hides bore scars fresh and raw, but their spirits had hardened like stone carved by wind. The leader walked to the front, her head high despite the ache in her wounds. She had seen death and met it without fear. The young followed near, her legs, their eyes filled with trust. They had learned that survival was not found in speed alone, but in unity and courage. The rear male limped, yet his place within the herd was secure. His body might weaken, but the story of his defiance would echo in every step the herd took. He was more than wounded flesh. He was proof that even in the face of death, resilience could shine brighter than fear. As the day warmed, the herd reached a ridge where the land opened into wide valleys of green. Ferns stretched like carpets, and streams wound silver through the fields. It was a place of promise, where food was abundant and cover plentiful. The leader paused on the ridge, gazing at the horizon. Behind her, the herd waited silent, as if sensing the weight of the moment. She gave a low call, deep and resonant. It rolled across the herd, carrying reassurance. The young answered with softer cries, and the adults followed with steady voices. Together their chorus rose into the air, not as a sound of prey, but as a declaration of endurance. The valley below seemed to answer with the whisper of wind through grass, as though the land itself acknowledged their survival. The herd descended into the new valley, leaving behind the shadows of fear. Life in the Jurassic would always bring predators, storms, and hunger, yet in this moment they had proven their strength. Every scar was a mark of survival, every step a promise to continue. As the sun climbed high, the Camptosaurus herd moved forward into light. Their story was not one of defeat, but of endurance. In their unity, they had carved their place in the ancient world, and in the silence of the valley, their survival echoed like an unbroken song.